Former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, who had said he would never criticize the sitting president, is blasting President Trump's call for the military to dominate the protesters. The retired Marine general accused the president of trying to divide the country. Mr. Trump fired back on Twitter, calling Mattis the world's most overrated general. Weijia Zhang is at the White House with more on this story. Weijia, this seems to be a big surprise from Mr. Mattis. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Gail, and good morning to everybody. General Mattis left the administration in 2018 over a policy disagreement, so it's not surprising that he and President Trump have differing views, but it is extraordinary how much of them he publicly shared. Mattis condemned the action against protesters near the White House and said it sets up a false conflict between the military and civilians. The current defense secretary is speaking out as well.
I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
Less than 48 hours after President Trump issued that warning this week to cities and states.
All right, people, welcome back to Dr. John Podcast. A political earthquake is rumbling through Washington, not from Democrats, but from Trump's own House Republicans, who for years marched in lockstep behind him. Something fundamental has broken in the relationship, playing out in real time in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. What we're witnessing is nothing less than the public unraveling of Trump's iron grip on Capitol Hill. This is the moment where the carefully constructed facade of total control is cracking wide open, and the cracks are spreading faster than anyone anticipated. We're talking about a growing coalition of GOP lawmakers who are not just privately grumbling over cocktails or whispering concerns in hallway corners. They're standing on the House floor, looking into television cameras.
Defense Secretary Mark Esper directly contradicted him Wednesday.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now.
Administration officials say the president may invoke the Insurrection Act, which could allow him to deploy troops to areas that have not requested federal assistance because he believes they need help controlling protests.
I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany says the president still has confidence in Esper.
If he loses confidence in Secretary Esper, I'm sure you all will be the first to know.
But as of right now, he still does?
As of right now, Secretary Esper is still Secretary Esper.
Shortly after, Mr. Trump's first defense secretary, General James Mattis, released a blistering rebuke of the president, writing, "Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us."
And casting votes directly against the president's wishes. They're issuing public statements that read like direct challenges to his authority. They're sitting across from journalists and describing his leadership in terms that range from disappointed to outright condemnatory. And in perhaps the most stunning development of all, senior Republican figures are now openly discussing impeachment proceedings and demanding that Trump consider stepping aside entirely. Let's pause and let that sink in for a moment, because the gravity of this cannot be overstated. For the better part of a decade, Donald Trump has dominated the Republican Party with an almost hypnotic hold. He commanded loyalty the way a warlord commands a tribe. House members feared him. They feared his social media wrath, feared the primary challenges he could orchestrate.
In a new interview, the former acting Secretary of Defense is says blame for the January 6th Capitol riot is on the former president of the United States, Donald Trump. This is really the first time that we've heard from Chris Miller since the insurrection. He was the acting defense secretary at the time, the man not only in charge of America's military, but also the man who had final approval on sending in the National Guard to stop the violence on that day, to send in reinforcements. Well, here he is speaking to Vice.
Do you think the president was responsible for what happened on the 6th?
I don't know, but it seems cause and effect. Yeah. The question is, would anybody have marched on the Capitol and overrun the Capitol without the president's speech? I think it's pretty much definitive that wouldn't have happened. So, yes.
Joining me right now is the former deputy FBI director, Andy McCabe. So, Andy, what did you think when you heard Miller lay the blame at Trump's feet? I mean, did this surprise you?
Well, it did, Kate. You know, it's always extraordinary when you hear someone who is that closely intertwined with the previous administration to come out and call out what many of us could see in plain sight.
feared the army of devoted followers who would turn on anyone who dared to cross their leader. That fear was the engine of his power. It was the invisible leash that kept every Republican senator and representative in check. But now, that leash is snapping. The fear is evaporating. And what's replacing it is something Trump never anticipated: a willingness to fight back. The timing couldn't be worse for the former president. At the exact moment when he needs unified support to push through his agenda, to demonstrate strength to his base, and to project an image of command and control, he's facing a rebellion from within his own ranks. House Republicans are looking at the political landscape and making calculations that would have been politically suicidal just a couple of years ago.
So I think it is surprising and significant that former acting Defense Secretary Miller is being that clear about the fact that it was Trump's words that caused the riot. However, I will say that later in the interview, he kind of hedges his bets a little bit by floating the idea that, well, it's not clear that Trump knew what he was doing or knew that his words would have that effect on the crowd, which I find to be much less believable.
Yeah, considering everyone said that his words were going to create violence and cause violence for months ahead of time. Miller also said that he did not speak to Donald Trump on the day of the insurrection, as this was all happening or even after. The Secretary of Defense did not speak to the Commander-in-Chief on the day that the seat of American democracy was being violently attacked. I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but did you find that surprising?
Well, it is. It's ridiculous. The day the Capitol gets sacked, the Secretary of Defense has no communication with the president. However, he did, when he answered that question, the question was, did you speak to the president or anyone else in the White House during the attack?
They're seeing his approval numbers sinking to levels that would terrify any political operative. They're watching independent voters in their districts recoil from the chaos and controversy. They're hearing from constituents who are exhausted by the nonstop drama, and they're concluding that blind loyalty to Trump is no longer a winning strategy. In fact, it's becoming a liability. The specific flashpoints are numerous and revealing. When the president signed an agreement with Iran that included provisions allowing the regime to sell oil immediately, it triggered a wave of outrage from Republicans who had spent years demanding maximum pressure on Tehran. They pointed to the absence of concrete restrictions on Iran's nuclear ambitions. They highlighted the worrying provisions that would allow Iran to eventually impose fees on ships traversing the Strait of Hormuz.
And he said, I didn't speak to the president. So I think it's still an open question as to whether or not he did make contact to maybe the president's chief of staff or other White House personnel. But still, that call should have been to the commander-in-chief, and it should have been to figure out how they were going to repel that attack. And clearly that didn't happen.
And just to remind folks, Miller has been criticized for potentially slow-walking approval in a critical time period about sending in the National Guard. The head of the National Guard, you and I were on together and talked about this. He raised this question while testifying before Congress when we learned that approval to send in the Guard, where Chris Miller is the final approver, took more than 3 hours. I want to play for you how Chris Miller responded to that in this interview.
It comes back to understanding how the military works. This isn't a video game. It's not Halo. It's not, Black Ops, Call to Duty.
It's also not 3 hours and 19 minutes. Does this answer this key question stemming from what were the failures exposed on January 6th?
It does not. And look, no one was asking Chris Miller whether or not he thought the events that took place on January 6th were out of a video game. The fact is, his folks, his staff, were on that joint call with the Metropolitan Police Department, Capitol Police.
They expressed bewilderment at the president's own public comments suggesting that Iran should be allowed to maintain its missile programs, even though destroying those very missiles had been a stated objective of the entire military campaign. The criticism wasn't coming from across the aisle. It was coming from the president's own side of the aisle, and it was withering. But the discontent runs far deeper than any single policy disagreement. This is about the fundamental dynamic of power. For years, Trump operated on the assumption that he could bend the House to his will through sheer force of personality and the implied threat of political destruction. He believed that House Republicans would vote however he told them to vote, that they would rubber stamp any executive order, that they would defend any position he took, no matter how unpopular or controversial. He counted on their fear. He relied on their obedience. And for a long time, that strategy worked brilliantly. But now, according to detailed reporting from major outlets, House Republicans are increasingly willing to defy him on key votes. They're demonstrating a new independence that signals a profound shift in the balance of power. Consider what happened during a critical 24-hour period that has become emblematic of this new reality. Multiple House Republicans refused to go along with Trump's explicit wishes, and they did so despite intense pressure from multiple directions. The president himself was applying pressure directly. Vice President J.D. Vance was making calls and twisting arms. House Speaker Mike Johnson was working frantically to enforce party discipline, and yet the defections still happened. In one particularly striking example, 20 House Republicans voted to repeal a Trump executive order that was targeting federal workers' collective bargaining rights. 20. That's not a rounding error. That's a significant block of legislators looking directly at the president and saying, no. Think about what that represents. 20 House Republicans, each of whom had to know they would face the president's wrath. Each of whom had to anticipate the attacks on social media, the fundraising challenges, the primary threats, and they voted against him anyway. They calculated the risks and decided that defying Trump was actually the safer political play. That's a stunning reversal of everything we've come to expect from the GOP over the past decade. It's a moment that political historians will point to as a turning point, the instant when the spell was broken and the emperor's nakedness was revealed for all to see. And it's not just about the votes themselves, it's about what the votes represent. When House Republicans start defying the president on major policy questions, when they start voting to repeal his executive orders, when they start publicly criticizing his decisions, they're sending a signal that resonates far beyond Capitol Hill. They're signaling to every other Republican politician in the country that it's okay to break ranks. They're signaling to donors and activists that the Trump era might be winding down. They're signaling to the broader public that the president doesn't actually have the unified support of his own party. And once that perception takes hold, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The approval numbers tell a story that's impossible to ignore. According to extensive polling and analysis, Trump's approval rating has cratered to approximately 36%. For a president, that's not just bad, that's historically terrible. That's the kind of number that makes vulnerable House members in swing districts break out in a cold sweat. They look at those numbers and they see their own political futures flashing before their eyes. They recognize that if they're tied too closely to a president with such dismal approval ratings, they're going down with the ship. And so they start paddling in a different direction. They start creating distance. They start demonstrating independence. This is where the psychology of power becomes so crucial, because political control isn't just about having the votes or the institutional authority. It's about the perception of power. It's about the belief that the leader is strong, that resistance is futile, that compliance is the path to survival. For years, Trump maintained that perception through a combination of aggression, unpredictability, and sheer force of will. He convinced Republicans that crossing him would lead to political annihilation, but now that perception is being shattered. House Republicans are witnessing their colleagues defy Trump and survive. They're seeing that the threats aren't always carried out. They're observing that the political consequences aren't as dire as they once feared. And with each successful defiance, the fear dissipates a little more. The public calls for Trump to resign represent perhaps the most dramatic escalation yet. When a senior Republican lawmaker stands up and demands that the president step aside, when they threaten to introduce articles of impeachment if he refuses, we have entered completely uncharted territory. This isn't some fringe figure or backbench gadfly making noise for attention. These are established, respected members of the Republican conference who are saying things that would have been unthinkable just months ago. And the fact that they're saying it publicly, that they're willing to put their names and their reputations on the line, demonstrates just how much the political landscape has shifted. Trump's response to these challenges has been revealing in its own right. Rather than dismissing the criticism with the confidence of a secure leader, he's reacted with visible fury. His social media posts have been laced with anger and defensiveness. He's lashed out at his Republican critics with the same ferocity he usually reserves for Democrats. He's shown that he's rattled, that he feels threatened, that he sees these developments as genuinely dangerous to his political survival. And that reaction itself is a sign of weakness. A truly confident leader would brush off such challenges, would show that they're beneath his notice. But Trump's angry, impulsive responses betray his anxiety and suggest that he understands how precarious his position has become. What's happening now is bigger than any single vote or any single defection. This is about a fundamental realignment of power within the Republican Party and within Congress as an institution. House Republicans are discovering that they have more power than they realized. They're learning that they can exercise that power independently. They're coming to understand that Trump is weaker than he appears and that they can afford to defy him without facing devastating consequences. And once that understanding takes hold, it spreads like wildfire. It emboldens others who might have been on the fence. It creates a momentum that becomes increasingly difficult to stop. The implications of this shift are profound. If House Republicans continue to defy Trump, if the pattern of rebellion spreads and accelerates, we could reach a tipping point where his control over the House collapses entirely. We could see a situation where House Republicans are making decisions based on their own judgment and their constituents' interests, rather than simply following Trump's directives. We could see Congress functioning as an actual check on presidential power rather than as a rubber stamp for executive overreach. We could see the balance of power in Washington fundamentally altered. This is what political scientists call a cascading collapse. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, incrementally, as confidence erodes and fear dissipates and the perception of power shifts. But then, at a certain point, the collapse becomes sudden and overwhelming. Once enough Republicans have broken ranks, once the taboo against defying Trump has been destroyed, once the belief in his invincibility has been shattered, the whole structure can come crashing down with surprising speed. We're watching that process unfold in real time. The signs are everywhere. The defections on key votes, the public criticism from senior lawmakers, the calls for resignation and impeachment, the desperate, angry response from Trump himself. All of it points in the same direction. His dominance is fading. His control is weakening. His power is crumbling. And the House, that institution he once commanded with an iron fist, is slipping away from him. For vulnerable House Republicans in swing districts and purple states, the electoral calculation has become painfully clear. They need to show their constituents that they're independent thinkers, that they're not just robotic followers of the party line, that they're capable of making their own judgments. In districts where Trump is unpopular, where independent voters hold the balance of power, where suburban voters have turned away from the chaos and controversy, being too closely associated with Trump is political poison. And so these Republicans are moving to distance themselves. They're casting votes against him. They're issuing critical statements. They're demonstrating the independence that their voters are demanding. The broader institutional implications are equally significant. When Congress pushes back against executive overreach, when it asserts its constitutional authority as a co-equal branch of government, that's good for democracy. It's good for the rule of law. It's good for the system of checks and balances that the founders established. But for Trump, it's devastating. It means his executive orders can be challenged and overridden. It means his decisions can be scrutinized and rejected. It means his power can be limited and constrained. And that's precisely what's happening now. The courts have been blocking Trump's actions. The Supreme Court has been limiting his power. Foreign allies have stopped deferring to him. The military has shown resistance to some of his directives. And now, the House is joining this chorus of opposition. When multiple institutions all push back simultaneously, it creates a cascading effect that can rapidly erode presidential authority. Each institution that challenges Trump makes it easier for others to do the same. Each successful check on his power emboldens other institutions to assert themselves. And soon, the president finds himself hemmed in from all sides. The narrative that's emerging around all of this is powerful and self-reinforcing. Political commentators and viral content creators are all framing this as Trump's power crumbling. They're describing it as the beginning of the end of his political dominance. They're capturing the sense that his control is fading and his authority is diminishing. And these narratives matter because they shape how people think about power. They influence how politicians calculate their options. They affect how donors decide where to direct their money. They impact how activists choose to spend their energy. When the narrative says that Trump is losing power, it becomes easier for people to abandon him and harder for him to maintain his hold. So what comes next? The trend line is clear and troubling for the former president. We're going to continue seeing House Republicans defy him on key votes. We're going to continue hearing vocal criticism from within his own party. We're going to continue seeing threats of impeachment and demands for resignation. And each time that happens, it will reinforce the narrative that his power is crumbling and his control is slipping. Eventually, if this trend continues, we could reach a point where Trump loses effective control of the House entirely, not because Republicans lose their majority, but because House Republicans stop following his directives. They start making decisions independently. They start asserting their own authority. They start functioning as an actual legislative body rather than an extension of Trump's will. And that would represent a massive shift from where things have been for the past decade. The psychological dimension of this shift cannot be overemphasized. Political power is fundamentally about belief and momentum and fear. Leaders maintain control not just through institutions and mechanisms, but through the conviction that they're powerful and the fear of what happens if you cross them. But once people stop believing in the power and stop fearing the consequences of defiance, the whole structure becomes unstable. It can collapse with astonishing speed. That's what we're witnessing with Trump right now. The House is slipping away from him, his power is crumbling, and the Republican Party is beginning to move in a different direction. This isn't just about one bad vote or one embarrassing defection. This is about a fundamental shift in the balance of power within the Republican Party and within Congress. It's about House Republicans realizing that they have more power than they thought. It's about them understanding that they can exercise that power independently. It's about them coming to believe that Trump is weaker than he appears and that they can afford to defy him. And once that belief takes hold, once the psychology shifts, it spreads, it accelerates, it emboldens more and more Republicans to vote their conscience and represent their districts instead of simply following Trump's directives. Each time a Republican defies Trump and survives, it makes it easier for the next one to do the same. Each time a Republican criticizes Trump publicly and thrives, it reduces the fear for everyone else. It's a cascading effect that can transform the political landscape faster than anyone expects. What we're looking at potentially is the beginning of the end of Trump's dominance over the Republican Party, not with a dramatic confrontation or a single decisive event, but with a gradual erosion of belief in his power, with a slow but accelerating shift in the psychology of House Republicans, with the realization that the emperor has no clothes and that the threats he once wielded no longer carry the same weight. Trump's entire brand is built on the idea that he's powerful and in control. He's the guy who commands loyalty, who makes things happen, who bends the world to his will. But if he loses control of the House, that brand gets destroyed. That myth gets shattered. And once voters and politicians and activists stop believing that Trump is all-powerful and all-controlling, they stop wanting to follow him. They stop wanting to be associated with him. They start looking for alternatives. They start thinking about whether there's someone else who might be stronger or more effective. That's how political movements end, not with a bang, but with a gradual erosion of belief in the leader. And this moment with House Republicans defying Trump and his power crumbling might be the beginning of that end. It's the moment when people stop being afraid of him. It's the moment when they start realizing he's weaker than they thought. It's the moment when the cascading collapse of his power begins. The 20 House Republicans who voted to repeal Trump's executive order on federal workers might not see themselves as revolutionaries. They might just be responding to the political incentives they face in their districts. But collectively, they're doing something far more significant. They're breaking the taboo. They're demonstrating that defiance is possible. They're showing other Republicans that Trump can be challenged without catastrophic consequences. And by doing so, they're accelerating the collapse of his control. The senior Republican lawmakers who are calling for Trump's resignation and threatening impeachment might not succeed in removing him from office. But they're achieving something almost as important. They're giving permission to other Republicans to express their doubts. They're normalizing criticism of Trump. They're making it respectable to question his leadership. And once that genie is out of the bottle, it can never be put back. The narrative of Trump's power crumbling in the House is grounded in real congressional votes, real congressional actions, and real statements from House Republicans. The votes are real. The defections are real. The public calls for resignation are real. And those things are creating a new narrative about Trump's actual power and his actual limitations. That narrative is shaping how politicians, donors, and activists think about the future. And in politics, perception often becomes reality. If enough people believe that Trump's power is crumbling, then politicians start acting as if it's true. Donors start pulling back, activists start losing enthusiasm, and the actual power crumbles to match the narrative. So the narrative of power crumbling becomes self-fulfilling. It creates the very reality it describes. This is why the current moment is so critical. We're at a pivotal point where Trump's grip on the House and on the Republican Party is visibly slipping. His power is showing real cracks. His dominance is being challenged openly and publicly. And how that challenge develops in the coming weeks and months could reshape everything about American politics for years to come. The House is slipping away, the power is crumbling, and the Republican Party is beginning to chart a new course without the figure who once dominated it so completely.